So I'm going to say a few words about publication contracts now. So I have some golden rules, which may sound simple, but you'd be surprised how many authors stumble over one or more of these. The first one is read before you sign. I can't tell you how many authors, and maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but I'm always really surprised. I say, well, what did your contract say? And they say, I don't know, I'm just so excited that I signed it. Which is, an understandable reaction, but you're handing over a lot of rights. It dictates your obligations to your publisher. It dictates their obligations to you. So make sure you read it. And that leads me to number 2, which is make sure you understand it. Ask questions. Your publisher should be able to answer your questions. If they aren't willing to answer your questions, I would think twice about working with them. Your agent, if you have one, can answer questions. Organizations like mine might be able to help you interpret your contract terms. We aren't set up to give legal advice, so I can't tell you what to do, but find somebody, find other authors, talk to them, make sure you understand everything that's in that contract. The third point is negotiate for terms that are more favorable for you. This also comes as a surprise to a lot of authors who think that it's a one-sided deal, but it's not. I have never heard somebody that has tried to negotiate with their publisher, that their publisher just says, deal's off, I don't even want to talk to you anymore. Sometimes the publisher says, no, I'm not willing to do that, but I've never heard of anyone who just gets a deal pulled out from under them for asking for some things that they might want. This can vary a lot depending on your goals. I've spoken to people who care most about cover design. They don't really care about the rights portion. They don't care about this or that, but they really care about the look and the feel of their book. So that could be something you negotiate for. I think people should really think hard, it hasn't come across yet, about their rights and what rights they're giving their publisher. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. I've heard other people who are really attached, and maybe it's a memoir, they want to have in the contract that they're going to read the audiobook version of it. So there's no one-size-fits-all thing to negotiate for, but it matters what matters to you. The final golden rule is to keep your contract in a safe place. Again, this is based on tons and tons of experience working with authors who come to me. Maybe their book's out of print, they want to make it available again. And I say, well, where's your contract? And they say, I don't know, I recycled it or shredded it or it got lost in a move or I just don't have it anymore. So it's an important document, make sure you keep a copy of it. I said I'd say a few more words about what rights you're giving away. You can give away your rights in lots of different ways. You can give away just certain of your rights. So I said, for example, you might not give away the right to prepare derivative works. So the right for your publisher to make a movie out of your book, or other things. You might hold back on different formats that your publisher can make it available in. So you might say that this publisher can do hardback and paperback, but you don't want to give the audiobooks rights to them. Maybe they don't have an audiobooks department. Maybe they're not successful at placing audiobook rights. So maybe you don't give them the audiobook rights. Duration is another thing. So maybe you don't give, your publisher will likely ask for your copyright for the life of copyright. Again, remember that that's your life plus 70 years on top of that. So limited term contracts are not impossible to negotiate for. I know people that have negotiated for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It depends on your publisher's tolerance for that, but that's another thing that you could negotiate for. If you don't negotiate for a limited term contract, make sure that you have a very good out-of-print clause. So what that means is if the publisher no longer thinks the book is, for example, commercially viable and stops publishing it, there's a way for you to get your rights back. And then the big one is whether you're giving them the rights exclusively or non-exclusively. This varies by industry, by publisher. You're most likely going to be asked for an exclusive license, and this makes sense. Your publisher needs to recoup the cost of producing your book and getting it out there. So they want to be the only one that's able to do that. I've seen people successfully negotiate for exclusive license for a period of time, and then it rolls into a non-exclusive license. Remember, if you're giving your publisher the right to exclusively do something with that work, it means that even you as the author can't do that thing with your work. There's advances in royalties. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail right now. Make sure that it is in line with industry norms, and if it's not, make sure there's a reason that it's not. Third-party permissions is another thing that's really big for our members, especially if you're writing a nonfiction work, and you need to incorporate other people's material in your work. So, for example, if you're creating if you're an art historian and you want to incorporate paintings in your book because you're analyzing how the artist used light and shadows in that painting, you might need to incorporate a copy of that painting in your work. And so you need to figure out whether the publisher is going to do that for you, whether that's your responsibility, whether they let you rely on fair use, which is something I'm going to talk about soon. Warranties and indemnities are another big one to think about. Warranties is what you're promising your publisher, so you're promising them potentially that you didn't infringe on somebody else's copyright, that you don't have any defamatory content in your book. So really pay attention to that, because you can be on the hook for that. And that's related to indemnity clauses. So indemnity clauses are, they set out your rights and responsibilities in the event of a lawsuit, so you may have to indemnify your publisher for the cost of a lawsuit. That's another thing to think about. Usually you can't get rid of that clause, but one thing that you might be able to do is to change that clause so that you're not liable for frivolous lawsuits. So if it's a baseless lawsuit that somebody brings, you're not on the hook for that. Okay, so the third topic I want to talk a little bit about is fair use. So we do have a guide to fair use. This one is for nonfiction authors. How many of you have heard of fair use, at least in passing? Okay, roughly half to 2/3 of you. This is an area that we get a ton of questions about. I think that there's a lot of myths and confusion that run around fair use. I hate to tell you this, but part of the confusion is part of its inherent design and maybe its beauty. I'm not probably going to convince a lot of you of that tonight, but fair use is meant to be flexible. Anybody that tells you that there is a black and white formula for fair use or an amount that you can use and it's definitely okay is lying to you. The idea is that you look at the whole of the circumstances. This is by design. It is not a flaw. It is meant to be flexible. The more rigid it is, the more rigid it is in other countries, we see the less people are able to rely on it. So it's meant to evolve with technologies and time, and our fair use has done a pretty good job of doing that. That said, that there are 4 factors that Congress has said in the Copyright Act that courts must look at to consider whether something is fair use. So this gets us a lot of the way there to understanding how it might be applied. So the first is the purpose and character of the use. So this is the person that's actually using the copyrighted material. And the question really here is, how are they using it? What are they using it for? So the character and the purpose and the character of the use. If you're just using it in the same way that the original author did, the less likely it is to be fair use. And the more you're adding new context, new meaning, changing it, using it in a different way, the more likely it is to be fair use. So let me go back to the example of an art historian putting a painting in her book and talking about how the artist used light and shadows. This is using it for a different purpose than the original work. Contrast that with somebody who just prints copies of that painting and sells postcards based on it. Then you're more towards just using it for the inherent beautiful qualities of the original, so much less likely to be fair use. The second factor is the nature of the copyrighted work. So instead of looking at the use, this is looking at the work itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but this is rarely, if ever, decisive in the whole outcome. But what courts generally look at here is, was the original work really, really creative, or was it more factual? And if it was more factual, this is again the idea that copyright shouldn't stifle the progress of knowledge. If it's more factual, it's more likely to be fair use. The more creative it is, the more likely this is to weigh against fair use. But again, don't let that scare you. That's rarely decisive, and there are tons of examples of fair use using creative materials. The third factor is the amount that you use. So the more you use, the less likely it is to be fair use. The less you use, the more likely it is to be fair use. That's generally true, but the question here is also, was the amount you used reasonable in light of your purpose? So again, let me remind you of the art historian I have using the full picture of the painting. Well, if she needs to use the full painting to get her ideas across and her points and her critique of the artwork, she might need to use the whole painting, and that could be fair use. If she's just exploiting the whole painting, and maybe she's only just talking about how the artist draws hands, a court might say, well, she used more than she actually needed to if she was just talking about this particular piece of the painting. So it's really context dependent, and it is not always the case that you can't use the whole thing. It depends on how you're using it. If I had my PowerPoint up here, I'd play you a great little video of Cindy Lou Who. If you remember her, she was a cute little blonde toddler in The Grinch Who Stole Christmas with the pigtails. If you have some tolerance for the distasteful, I would have played this video, which is Cindy Lou Who all grown up. She's 45. She lives in a trailer park. She is a drug addict. She married the Grinch when she turned 18. She had his baby, and they had such an unhappy marriage, she ended up murdering him. And this is a play that was that came out recently. Actually, this lawsuit was just decided about, I think about a year ago. And the question was this infringement? The playwright used a ton from the original Dr. Seuss book. He used the character, he used the setting, he used a familiar style, he used rhyming couplets, and Dr. Seuss's estate wasn't happy about this, as you might imagine, and they sued. The court found here, using those 4 factors that I talked to you about, that this was fair use, even though a lot of this was used. And its rationale was this. So under the first factor, it was used for a completely different purpose than the original. In fact, it was a parody of the original. It was mocking it. What it was doing, it was having a cultural critique on the utopian society depicted in Seuss's original novel, and using that to poke fun of it. So the purpose was entirely different. It wasn't a children's novel. It had a different audience, and so on. Under the second factor, it said, well, yeah, it was a really creative work, so this slightly weighs against fair use, but this isn't decisive. The third factor, if you remember, is the amount used. And the court said, you know, the playwright used a lot of that original work, but it's okay because it was reasonable in light of the intended use. You needed that amount to conjure up the original in order for the purpose of the play to come across as a critique of Dr. Seuss's utopia that he created. You needed that amount to really conjure up the original.